How far back does a curse truly reach? Can a stain on the soul of one generation truly bleed into the next, manifesting as something tangible, something horrific, nearly a century later? For decades, stories like these have been relegated to the realm of folklore, whispers dismissed as local superstition. But what if the evidence, meticulously gathered and tragically documented, tells a different tale? What if, buried deep within America's forgotten landscapes, a history of unimaginable horror continues to unfold far from the eyes of a world convinced of its own rational mastery? This is the story of the Miller family, a narrative so profoundly disturbing, so stubbornly defiant of logic, that it challenges our very understanding of time, lineage, and the enduring power of ancient wrongs. It is a case that has remained largely untold until now. Our journey begins in the vast, indifferent expanse of rural Kansas, a land where the sky seems to press down with an almost physical weight. Here, the wind is a constant companion, a mournful, rasping breath that carries the scent of dry earth and the phantom echo of a distant, desperate era. Scattered across this desolate canvas lie the skeletal remains of forgotten farm equipment, monuments to an agricultural dream long since choked by the dust. This is a place steeped in hardship, a landscape scarred by the monumental struggles of the 1930s, when the Dust Bowl devoured lives and livelihoods. The Miller homestead, a weathered sentinel against the relentless elements, stands as a testament to survival. Yet it is also a prison. For generations, the Millers have clung to this property, isolated not just by geography, but by a shared, unspoken dread. They are survivors, yes, but survivors of a monstrous secret, one born from the desperate hunger and unforgivable choices made during the darkest days of the Great Depression. History books often recount the economic devastation, the mass migration, the sheer human suffering of that period. But for the Millers, the price of survival was not merely poverty. It was a pact, a dark bargain with something ancient and terrestrial, a bargain that twisted their very bloodline. This wasn't just a metaphor for their struggle. It was a literal, meticulously maintained curse, passed down through rituals whispered in hushed tones, designed to stave off the ultimate price. They lived, generation after generation, with the quiet horror of a legacy they could not escape, a legacy demanding constant vigilance. Their existence was a fragile piece, a delicate balance maintained through strict adherence to arcane rules. But that piece shattered. It began subtly, insidiously, a creeping dread that solidified with the unexpected arrival of an unnaturally dark and silent windstorm. This wasn't merely a weather phenomenon. It was the unprecedented manifestation of the Black Wind Night, an entity of dread long feared in their family lore. And as the storm descended, so too did the terror. The youngest member of the Miller lineage, a child, began exhibiting symptoms that defied medical explanation, symptoms that were terrifyingly, undeniably inhuman. Then came the sudden, violent death of a family elder, an event so brutal, so incomprehensible, that it broke their centuries-old code of silence. Desperate, terrified, and with their traditional methods failing, the Millers did the unthinkable. They reached out. They sought help from the outside world, inadvertently inviting a team of initially skeptical documentarians, our team, to witness their living nightmare. What we found defied every preconceived notion, every rational explanation. The Millers were not simply suffering from an inherited mental illness or the psychological scars of their isolated existence. They were engaged in a harrowing race against time, a desperate struggle to decipher the arcane rules of the Black Wind Night curse, to unearth the true depth of their ancestors' transgression, and to find a way to sever the bloody ties that bound them to this unforgiving land. Their fight was for survival, for redemption, for the very soul of their family, before the lineage was extinguished and the devastating secret lost forever. This is not just a story of a family, it is a profound historical document, a chilling testament to the terrifying persistence of past sins, a warning whispered on the black wind for nearly a century. Can one truly escape a horror woven into the very fabric of their bloodline? The Miller case suggests otherwise. The Miller family's desperate appeal, steeped in the language of curses and ancient evils, found an unlikely recipient in Dr. Eleanor Vance. A towering figure in the American scientific community, Dr. Vance was not a paranormal investigator, nor was she someone who entertained notions of the supernatural. Her entire illustrious career as a medical anthropologist at one of the nation's most prestigious universities, the University of Chicago, was built upon the rigorous application of the scientific method to explain phenomena often misattributed to the mystical or inexplicable. Her selection by the documentary team was a deliberate counterpoint, a strategic move to infuse the Millers' extraordinary claims with an unyielding dose of empirical reality. If a rational explanation existed, Dr. Vance was the one uniquely qualified to unearth it, to peel back layers of folklore and reveal the tangible truth. Dr. Vance, sharp-eyed and possessed of an almost unsettling analytical precision, had spent decades dissecting the complex interplay between human health, environment, and cultural belief systems across the American landscape. Her landmark publications included a seminal work on endemic illnesses in isolated agricultural communities of the Midwest, meticulously tracing patterns of disease to subtle, long-term shifts in local hydrology and specific soil compositions over generations. Another explored the long-term neurological impacts of specific nutrient deficiencies, a common plight during periods of widespread rural poverty and environmental catastrophe, particularly evident in historical accounts from the Great Depression era. She had famously consulted on cases of mass psychogenic illness in historical contexts, consistently demonstrating that what appeared to be inexplicable outbreaks of madness or shared delusions were in fact acute psychological responses to collective trauma or subtle exposure to environmental contaminants, often exacerbated by prevailing cultural anxieties. Her professional reputation was unassailable, forged in the crucible of verifiable data and rigorous peer-reviewed analysis, solidifying her status as a leading American academic authority in her field. When the initial, fragmented reports of the Miller family's situation reached her, filtered through the agitated accounts of the documentary crew, Dr. Vance's mind immediately began categorizing and compartmentalizing. The Black Wind Night and the generational curse were, to her, nothing more than the symptomatic language of profound rural isolation, endemic economic despair, and undiagnosed, likely hereditary medical conditions. The young child's terrifying manifestations were clinical symptoms awaiting a diagnosis, not a supernatural possession. The elder's sudden death, while tragic and deeply unsettling to the family, was a medical event, potentially a cardiovascular incident or an unknown congenital defect, awaiting a forensic pathologist's definitive report. Her immediate, unwavering focus shifted to the quantifiable, the quality of the local water supply, the precise history of pesticide and herbicide use on the Miller farm, the family's long-term dietary habits, and any genetic predispositions that might be exacerbated by their specific environment and historical conditions. Dr. Vance's unwavering skepticism was not a barrier to investigation. It was, paradoxically, the very engine of her methodology. She understood implicitly that human belief systems, no matter how irrational they might appear on the surface, often had tangible roots in deeply felt, perhaps misinterpreted, lived experience. Her task, as she saw it, was to carefully excavate those roots, to unearth the underlying verifiable causes. She demanded unfettered access, every medical record pertaining to the Miller family, regardless of age, stretching back as far as documentation allowed. Detailed historical weather patterns for the Kansas plains, particularly during the calamitous Dust Bowl era, including precise wind velocity and dust storm data. Comprehensive soil and water samples from every inch of the Miller property, including any abandoned wells, cisterns, or forgotten agricultural chemical storage sites, and unrestricted access to the family members themselves for extensive physical, neurological, and psychological evaluations. She intended to treat the Miller homestead as a vast, complex living laboratory. Every alleged phenomenon, every whispered fear, every physical symptom, a data point to be rigorously scrutinized and empirically validated. Her core team, assembled with the same exacting standards that characterized her own work, mirrored her scientific ethos. It included Dr. Marcus Thorne, a forensic pathologist renowned for his chilling ability to uncover elusive causes of death, particularly in cases initially shrouded in mystery or suspicion. Alongside him was Dr. Anya Sharma, an environmental toxicologist whose expertise lay in tracing insidious contaminants through complex ecological systems and their long-term effects on human populations. Complementing them was Dr. David Chen, a clinical psychologist specializing in intergenerational trauma, the psychological effects of prolonged adversity, and the propagation of shared cultural narratives within isolated communities. Their initial briefings from Dr. Vance were pragmatic, devoid of any narrative embellishment or speculative language, focusing instead on establishing rigorous protocols for evidence collection, sample preservation, and advanced analytical techniques. They were instructed to gather every conceivable piece of information: comprehensive geological surveys, detailed air quality reports, exhaustive medical examinations of every living Miller family member, and meticulous psychological assessments to identify any potential shared delusions, cognitive biases, or the lingering effects of historical, environmental, or social trauma. Their collective objective was to construct an unimpeachable, purely scientific narrative that would explain the Miller family's suffering. The very concept of a curse or a pact with darkness was an intellectual anathema to Dr. Vance. Her extensive academic research into historical accounts of perceived curses across diverse cultures and time periods had consistently revealed the presence of identifiable societal stressors, unrecognized environmental pathogens, or the profound misinterpretation of natural phenomena. She had, for instance, famously reevaluated the American cursed land narratives common in the 19th and early 20th centuries, not as evidence of malevolent spirits, but as tragic consequences of undiscovered geological hazards, lead poisoning from tainted water supplies, or localized outbreaks of virulent diseases exacerbated by poor sanitation. For Dr. Vance, the Miller family's narrative was merely another variation on an ancient human tendency to attribute the frightening and the unknown to malevolent, non-quantifiable forces when scientific understanding was lacking. Her academic mission was to provide that understanding, to illuminate the perceived darkness with the piercing light of verifiable fact, not to indulge in fanciful imaginings or sensationalist claims. She viewed the unfolding drama at the Miller homestead not as a supernatural thriller, but as a compelling human case study ripe for scientific dissection. The brutal history of the Dust Bowl, with its unprecedented environmental catastrophe, economic devastation, and profound psychological toll on rural American families, provided, in her expert opinion, a fertile ground for such deeply ingrained, irrational narratives to take root and flourish across generations. Dr. Vance was resolute in her determination to peel back these layers of inherited belief, intergenerational trauma, and rural isolation. Her unwavering goal was to uncover the true biological, environmental, or psychological triggers behind the Miller family's unfolding nightmare. Her method was simple, direct, and unyielding. Gather all evidence, test all hypotheses, and systematically eliminate every possibility until only the truth, a scientific truth, remained. She arrived in Kansas, not to chase phantoms or validate superstitions, but to dissect a deeply ingrained delusion, utterly confident that she would ultimately provide a rational, empirical explanation for the whispered horrors afflicting the Miller family. Her reputation, her very professional identity, rested squarely on it. The Miller family's existence had long been a silent testament to the devastating endurance of the Dust Bowl shadow. For decades, they were little more than a fading name in county records, an isolated anachronism on the maps of rural Kansas. Their occasional, cryptic appeals for agricultural aid or emergency medical services were often met with bureaucratic inertia, or dismissed if the eccentricities of a family too proud, or perhaps too stubborn, to leave the blighted land. They had, in essence, perfected the art of vanishing in plain sight. It was this profound, almost willful isolation that paradoxically became their only avenue for hope when their world finally began to unravel. The catalyst was not a direct plea for supernatural intervention, but a series of desperate, veiled inquiries that found their way to the desk of Professor Eris Thorne, a distinguished rural sociologist and environmental historian at the University of Kansas. Thorne was renowned for his exhaustive, often somber, ethnographic studies of communities scarred by ecological catastrophe, particularly those who had remained in the arid heartland long after the black blizzards had receded. He possessed a rare empathy for forgotten narratives, coupled with an unwavering commitment to scientific rationalism. The initial communication from the Miller family was not a phone call, nor a formal letter of distress, but a series of meticulously handwritten notes relayed through a distant, equally reclusive cousin in a neighboring county, and eventually forwarded by a bewildered local historical society. These disjointed messages spoke not of a curse, but of an escalating land sickness affecting their youngest child, presenting symptoms that defied conventional medical diagnosis. They described an unnaturally rapid decline in the boy's vitality, punctuated by episodes of profound disorientation and a disturbing affinity for the darkest corners of their decaying farmhouse. They referenced an increasing number of unseasonal dust intrusions within the home, a fine, almost supernaturally clinging grit that appeared even on windless days, seemingly emanating from the very foundations of the dwelling. Accompanying these alarming personal accounts were fragmented descriptions of the property itself. The Millers detailed an accelerating decay of their structures, far beyond what neglect or typical weather patterns could explain. Support beams seemed to twist and splinter from within, metal rusted with unnatural speed, and fertile patches of their meager garden inexplicably withered and blackened overnight. They spoke of a pervasive, inexplicable chill that clung to the air indoors, and a silent, oppressive pressure that settled over the farm during the late hours, particularly preceding the sudden, violent death of the family elder. That passing, vaguely attributed to a heart attack by the distant coroner, was presented by the Millers as a direct consequence of this land sickness, a final symptom of the deepening malady. For Professor Thorne, these communications initially presented as a compelling, albeit tragic, case study in the extreme psychological and physical toll of long-term environmental degradation and socioeconomic isolation. He hypothesized a complex interplay of factors: chronic exposure to dormant agricultural pathogens, perhaps exacerbated by unusual localized weather phenomena, compounded by severe familial stress and a desperate, culturally ingrained reliance on folkloric explanations for otherwise explainable misfortunes. The mention of black wind and ancestral burdens was dismissed by Thorne as classic examples of rural superstition, coping mechanisms for insurmountable hardship. He saw not a supernatural threat, but an opportunity to document the last vestiges of a truly unique and perhaps tragically doomed cultural enclave. His proposal to the university was framed entirely within the boundaries of his academic discipline. A rapid response ethnographic study of a severely distressed, isolated rural family unit, potentially suffering from an undiagnosed environmental illness and severe psychological distress rooted in generations of hardship. He emphasized the urgency, noting the potential for the extinction of this unique cultural dataset if intervention was not swift. The university, always keen to support compelling field research, approved the limited funding and resources required for a preliminary assessment. Thorne assembled a small, discreet team. A former graduate student, now a research assistant specializing in digital archiving and rural photography, was enlisted to document the physical environment. A local medical professional, known for her stoic demeanor and experience with underserved communities, was asked to accompany them for the initial health assessment of the child, under the guise of a public health initiative. They packed basic field equipment, cameras, audio recorders, soil sample kits, air quality monitors, and standard medical diagnostic tools. There was no room in Thorne's meticulous planning for anything beyond the tangible. The journey itself underscored the Millers' isolation. Miles of gravel roads dissolved into barely discernible tracks, weaving through a landscape that seemed to actively resist modern intrusion. As they drove deeper into the desolate plains, the air grew heavy, the sky a muted, oppressive gray, despite the absence of immediate storm clouds. The wind, when it stirred, was unlike any Thorne had ever encountered, not sharp and cutting, but a low, mournful sigh that seemed to carry the weight of generations of sorrow. He attributed it to the unique acoustics of the flat, open land, an effect of vast, unbroken space. But even Thorne, a man grounded in empirical observation, felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, an almost imperceptible tightening in his chest. It was a sensation he calmly dismissed as the natural anxiety of approaching a distressed situation, the silent prelude to a grim but ultimately explainable truth. Dr. Elias Thorne, a leading academic in American folklore and cultural history, arrived at the Miller homestead with a professional skepticism honed over decades of debunking alleged paranormal phenomena. His documentary team, equipped with the latest scientific instrumentation, an array of atmospheric sensors, ground-penetrating radar, and advanced biomonitors, shared his empirical bias. The Miller family's desperate plea, relayed through a series of increasingly frantic and disjointed phone calls, spoke of an ancient curse and a black wind, narratives Thorne initially dismissed as classic rural superstition, a family clinging to myth in the face of profound personal tragedy. The landscape itself, however, immediately struck Thorne as profoundly different from anything he had encountered in his extensive fieldwork. It was not merely barren or drought-stricken. It felt profoundly weary, as if the very earth had been leached not just of moisture, but of life and hope. The air was thick with an unusually fine, persistent dust, a constant presence that coated everything, including their sensitive equipment. Yet standard tests for common particulate matter yielded inconsistent results. The Miller house stood as a stark testament to stoic endurance and slow decay, its weathered timber groaning under the slightest breeze, whispering of countless harsh seasons endured and unspeakable burdens carried. Their initial encounter with the Miller family was a tense affair, heavy with unspoken dread and a palpable sense of resignation. Patriarch Thomas Miller, gaunt and taciturn, seemed less concerned with convincing the outsiders than with simply enduring. His wife Martha clutched their youngest, a child named Sarah, close to her side. Sarah's condition was immediately disquieting. Her skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and a faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through her small frame, even when at rest. Her eyes, however, were the most striking, unnaturally wide, profoundly dark, and seemed to hold an ancient, unsettling knowledge that belied her tender age. Thorne began his systematic investigation, a methodical process designed to either confirm or, more likely, dismiss the family's claims. While his team set up atmospheric sensors, conducted preliminary geological surveys, and established remote monitoring stations around the perimeter of the property, he meticulously documented the house's history. He pored over faded ledgers, examined brittle, yellowed photographs, and scrutinized the few remaining family heirlooms, searching for any logical precursor to their story. He noted the pervasive, almost sentient dust, unlike any he had encountered, microscopic and strangely abrasive. It defied easy classification, and the constant, almost subliminal irritation it caused was a subtle, unnerving constant. His professional focus soon narrowed to Sarah. Observing her closely, Thorne noted a disturbing pattern that defied medical explanation. During certain periods, often correlating with subtle shifts in the otherwise still air outside, Sarah's tremors intensified. Her normally quiet breathing would become ragged, almost gasping, and faint, almost unnoticeable markings would appear on her skin. These were not rashes or typical allergic reactions. They were thin, dark lines that seemed to form and fade with an alarming rapidity, resembling something etched onto the flesh itself, then erased by an unseen hand. The very concept challenged his understanding of dermatological phenomena. One evening, as a peculiar, almost unnatural stillness descended upon the Miller property, a quiet that seemed to absorb all ambient sound, Thorne was reviewing the initial sensor data. The atmospheric pressure readings were erratic, fluctuating wildly within short intervals, defying standard meteorological explanations for such a calm, windless night. Simultaneously, a geophone placed deep beneath the foundation of the house registered faint, rhythmic vibrations. Too regular to be natural earth tremors, yet too deep and resonant to be attributed to any superficial activity. It felt like a heartbeat, or perhaps something grinding slowly beneath the soil. Then, the first undeniable, profoundly unsettling anomaly occurred. While examining an old, leather-bound family Bible, a massive tome passed down through generations, Thorne noticed something peculiar about the paper itself. It was brittle, stained with age, but on certain pages, particularly those detailing the birth and death dates of Miller ancestors from the desperate years of the 1930s, there were faint, almost imperceptible scorch marks. These were not from fire. Rather, they looked as if the very fibers of the paper had been seared by an intense, fleeting heat, a heat that had warped the ink without consuming the page, an impossible paradox. The surrounding paper was untouched. And then, a detail that sent a cold wave down his spine. On a page dated 1934, amidst a list of names, a faint, almost invisible symbol was pressed deep into the paper. It was a unique sigil, unlike any known heraldry or arcane script Thorne had encountered in his extensive studies of historical symbology. It wasn't drawn with ink. It seemed to be a brand, a deep impression made without tearing the delicate paper. Thorn ran a specialized UV light over it. The symbol didn't just fluoresce. It glowed with a faint, disturbing luminescence, a light that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, almost a heartbeat of light, before slowly fading back into invisibility. This was not a hoax. This was not mass delusion. The inexplicable scorch marks, the wildly fluctuating atmospheric readings that defied physical laws, the strange rhythmic vibrations emanating from the earth, and now this inexplicable symbol, branded with a non-chemical luminescence, began to systematically dismantle Elias Thorne's carefully constructed world of scientific certainty. He had come seeking a rational explanation for irrational fears, expecting to provide comfort through logic. What he was finding were anomalies that defied the very laws of physics and chemistry he understood, tangible evidence of something beyond his academic purview. The Miller family's living nightmare, it seemed, was beginning to bleed inexorably into his own objective reality. The silence of the Kansas plains no longer felt merely desolate. It felt watchful, pregnant with a history far more sinister than any mere Dust Bowl tragedy could account for. The old Miller homestead, a monument to forgotten promise, held more than just dust and decay. It held secrets. Our team, led by Dr. Alistair Finch, a historical anthropologist with a particular expertise in American rural communities and the darker currents of folklore, meticulously combed through the remnants of generations. Every splintered floorboard, every cobwebbed corner, became a potential repository for the truth the Millers had tried so desperately to bury. The main house was a time capsule of quiet despair. Rooms lay frozen in states of neglect, furniture draped in tattered sheets like spectral forms. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, aged paper, and something else, something indefinable that clung to the very fabric of the place, a lingering miasma of sorrow. Dr. Finch, with his methodical approach and keen eye for anomalies, focused on the few areas the family had left relatively untouched: the cluttered study of the deceased elder, Eleanor Miller, and a small, rarely used root cellar beneath the kitchen. It was in that root cellar, a space once vital for sustenance, now choked with generations of forgotten detritus, that the first true crack in the Miller family's wall of silence appeared. Amidst rusted canning jars, faded burlap sacks, and the skeletal remains of forgotten harvest, Dr. Finch located a heavy, iron-bound wooden chest. Its surface was scarred, its lock corroded, but a faint, almost invisible carving on its lid caught his attention. A stylized, ancient symbol, one he'd encountered in his studies of pre-industrial agricultural rights, though rarely in an American context. The contents of the chest were equally telling. Layers of brittle, yellowed cloth concealed a collection of artifacts that defied the Millers' public image as simple Kansas farmers. There were small, crudely carved wooden effigies, dried herbs bundled with frayed twine, and an assortment of tarnished silver pieces, some shaped into forms that hinted at a forgotten pagan iconography. But the most significant find lay at the very bottom, wrapped in a linen shroud that crumbled at the slightest touch: a large, leather-bound journal. The journal's cover bore no title, no author. Its pages, however, were filled with a spidery, precise hand, dated meticulously from the autumn of 1933 through the brutal winter of 1935. The entries detailed not daily farm life, but a descent into an unholy desperation. The language was archaic, almost biblical in its pronouncements, peppered with references to the pact, the dark offering, and the great hunger. It spoke of the earth itself turning against them, of crops failing, of livestock perishing, and of the agonizing choice facing the earliest Miller patriarch, Elias Miller: Dr. Finch recognized the profound historical weight of the period. The Dust Bowl was not merely an environmental disaster. It was a societal cataclysm that shattered the American heartland. Drought and economic depression converged, stripping away not just livelihoods, but hope. In such extreme conditions, people resorted to extreme measures. Faith withered or twisted into unrecognizable forms. Superstition, long dormant, resurfaced with terrifying. The first entries detailed conventional struggles, pleas to God for rain. But as hope dwindled, the narrative shifted. Elias Miller's words grew frantic, then chillingly resolved. He wrote of consultations with an unnamed traveler, of ancient traditions whispered on the wind, of a blood price demanded by the land itself for its bounty. The journal outlined specific rituals, performed under the cover of what Elias called the Black Wind. Times when the dust storms were so thick, so suffocating, that they blotted out the sun, turning day into an unnatural night. This was the Black Wind night the current Miller family spoke of, not just a meteorological phenomenon, but a ritualistic window. Elias's entries became less about survival and more about a dark, binding contract. He detailed offerings, not of crops or livestock, but of something far more precious, something integral to the Miller lineage itself. The text was deliberately vague in places, almost coded, as if Elias feared even the paper would betray his horrifying actions. Yet, the implications were unmistakable. A life, or lives, had been taken, sacrificed to appease an ancient terrestrial hunger, promising temporary prosperity in exchange for a horrifying generational debt. Dr. Finch, accustomed to separating historical fact from rural myth, found himself confronting something entirely new. The meticulous detail, the raw terror evident in Elias's shaky hand, lent an unsettling authenticity to the journal's claims. This was not the product of a deranged mind, but the desperate accounting of a man driven to an unimaginable act by forces beyond his control. Or so he believed. The symbols on the artifacts, the recurring phrases, the dates aligning with the darkest periods of the Dust Bowl, it all converged into a horrifying tapestry of historical truth and supernatural terror. The discovery fundamentally shifted the parameters of our investigation. What began as an inquiry into alleged familial delusion now held the chilling weight of documented evidence. The journal was more than a relic. It was a confession, a testament to a monstrous pact forged in desperation, a pact that was now, nearly a century later, demanding its terrifying due. The Miller family's curse was not a fanciful tale, but a meticulously recorded legacy of blood and sacrifice, binding them to the land and to a horror that refused to remain buried. The questions multiplied, but the path forward, though terrifying, was now horrifyingly clear. Understand the full extent of Elias Miller's bargain, and perhaps, just perhaps, find a way to sever the ties before the Black Wind night claimed its final, devastating price. The air thickened, a palpable weight pressing down on the isolated homestead, as the Black Wind night descended not as a storm, but as a living, malevolent entity. It was not the familiar howl of a prairie gale, but a low, guttural thrum that vibrated through the very foundations of the old Miller house, chilling bones before it even touched skin. The unnatural darkness that had swallowed the afternoon sun now became absolute, impenetrable. Lights within the home flickered erratically, casting grotesque, elongated shadows that danced like tormented spirits, stretching and shrinking with a pulse of their own. It was the child who bore the brunt of its initial fury. The subtle tremors that had marked the curse's insidious return escalated into violent convulsive spasms. The child's eyes, once wide with innocent fear, now rolled back, revealing nothing but whites, or worse, glinted with an ancient, malevolent intelligence that spoke of something far older and more terrible than a human mind. Unintelligible words, guttural and chilling, issued from the child's throat. Words that seemed to resonate with the low, moaning wail of the wind outside. They were sounds that did not belong to a child, or even a human being, but to something primordial and deeply wounded. For the documentarians, their professional skepticism, their scientific detachment, shattered in that instant. This was no longer a case study, a fascinating anomaly to be catalogued. It was an immediate, visceral threat. Their equipment, once a shield of rational observation, became useless. Cameras glitched and died. Audio recorders captured nothing but static laced with phantom whispers, and portable power sources drained inexplicably within moments. The very fabric of their carefully constructed reality began to fray, exposing the raw, terrifying truth of the Miller family's nightmare. Within the decaying walls, the phenomenon manifested with terrifying clarity. Unseen forces moved through the rooms. Doors slammed shut with bone-jarring force. Windows rattled as if struck by invisible fists, and the temperature plummeted to an unbearable, unnatural cold that seemed to suck the warmth directly from their bodies. Objects, heirlooms that had graced the Miller mantelpiece for generations, flew across rooms with destructive velocity, narrowly missing family members and crew alike. The distinct scent of turned earth, of dust and decay, grew overpowering, as if the very soil outside had breached the sanctity of their refuge. Outside, the black wind did more than merely blow. It seemed to coalesce, taking on a formless, swirling presence, pressing against the windows and walls with an almost sentient malice. It whispered, a chorus of agonized cries and desperate pleas, indistinguishable from the screams of the wind itself, yet undeniably human. The homestead became a crucible, the ancient land itself rising up to reclaim its due, the boundaries between the living and the spectral dissolving into a maelstrom of terror. The rusted farm implements outside, once silent sentinels, now seemed to twist and groan, their metal protesting as if alive. The Miller family, driven by generations of inherited dread, attempted their desperate, arcane countermeasures. They invoked fragmented rituals, whispered ancient words passed down through their bloodline, movements that were both practiced and profoundly desperate. But these efforts, once their only shield, now seemed to provoke the entity further. The violence within the house intensified, the attacks becoming more direct, more personal. Shadows detached themselves from corners, coalescing into fleeting, menacing forms that darted through their peripheral vision, their touch leaving lingering chills. One of the crew, a sound engineer, was violently thrown against a wall by an invisible force, his screams echoing over the din of the wind and the chaos. A camera operator found herself inexplicably pinned, her body contorted by an unseen weight, only to be released suddenly, gasping for breath. The imprint of a monstrous, clawed hand burned into her skin through her jacket. This was no longer a haunting. It was a siege. The ancient pact had finally come to collect, not just a life, but the very essence of the Miller lineage, seeking to extinguish their light and anyone unfortunate enough to be trapped in their orbit. All avenues of escape vanished. The homestead's generator sputtered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness, save for the sporadic flashes of spectral light that originated from nowhere and everywhere. Communication lines went dead. Their vehicles, previously reliable, refused to start, their engines groaning like dying beasts. They were isolated, completely at the mercy of the black wind night and the horrors it unleashed. The curse was not merely a historical footnote, but a present, tangible, and overwhelmingly malevolent force. The academic authority, who had sought to categorize and explain, could only watch as the known world dissolved into something horrifyingly primal, a truth too terrible for science to bear. The Miller family's fight for survival had begun, a struggle against a horror woven into the very fabric of their bloodline, manifesting now, demanding its bloody inheritance. The specialist, Dr. Elias Vance, a cultural historian accustomed to the cold rationality of archives, had always maintained a professional distance, treating the Miller family's claims as symptoms of inherited trauma, but collective delusion born from generations of hardship. His initial skepticism was a necessary shield against the raw, unfathomable dread radiating from the Miller homestead. But as weeks turned into months, and the phenomenon deepened, his methodical investigation into the region's forgotten history began to peel back layers of official records, revealing a darker undercurrent beneath the documented facts of the Dust Bowl. Vance's research, meticulously pieced together from obscure local gazettes, agricultural agency reports from the 1930s, and even fragmented oral histories passed down through non-Miller families in the surrounding counties, painted a picture far more disturbing than environmental disaster alone. He unearthed references to ancient Native American beliefs concerning specific ley lines or energy conduits within the very plains, often associated with a primordial entity, a terrestrial spirit of the land itself. These beliefs, largely dismissed or violently suppressed, spoke of the land's capacity for both immense life and terrible wrath, a balance delicately maintained by specific appeasement rituals performed by indigenous peoples for millennia. The arrival of settlers, their disregard for traditional land stewardship, and the catastrophic farming practices of the early 20th century had not merely disturbed an ecological balance, they had ruptured a deeper, more ancient accord. The Dust Bowl, Vance theorized, was not solely a natural phenomenon. For some, it was the land's desperate gasp, a violent convulsion in response to unprecedented desecration. And within this cataclysm, amidst the starvation and despair, the Miller ancestors had committed their unspeakable act. Vance discovered oblique references to a black offering made by a desperate pioneer family during the absolute nadir of the drought in 1934. A period marked by unprecedented dust storms and unexplainable livestock deaths. These accounts were never explicitly linked to the Millers, but the geographical coordinates, the timing, and the specific chilling description of the offering, not of food or animals, but of something far more precious, a direct transference of vitality from one living soul to another, began to align with the Miller family's whispered horror. The patriarch of that generation, a man named Thomas Miller, had not merely sought survival. He had sought prosperity, a desperate yearning to break free from the cyclical poverty that plagued the plains. He had, Vance concluded, stumbled upon or been given knowledge of a perverted ritual, twisted from ancient appeasement rites into a dark bargain. The Black Wind, as the Millers called it, was not just a symbol of the curse, it was the entity itself, or its primary agent, manifest in the dust and despair, returning every generation to collect its due, feeding on the fear and the lifeblood of the lineage. The ancient pact demanded not just a soul, but a specific, inherent energy that could only be harvested from a direct blood descendant, a purity of lineage corrupted for consumption. As Vance presented his findings to the Miller family, the youngest child, Elias, convulsed on the living room floor, his small body racked by tremors that seemed to emanate from within, not without. His eyes, once bright and curious, were now wide and unfocused, filled with an ancient predatory hunger that terrified his parents. The family elder, already weakened by the escalating manifestations, clutched an old, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with cryptic entries and crude drawings that mirrored Vance's terrifying conclusions. The curse was indeed generational, meticulously recorded by each patriarch. Each entry a desperate attempt to decipher the entity's arcane rules and stave off the inevitable. The journal revealed the true horror of the Black Offering. It was not a single sacrifice, but a cycle of veiled offerings, each generation unknowingly replenishing the entity with a fraction of its own life force. A slow bleed designed to keep the Miller family bound to the land and its dark bargain. But Thomas Miller's ultimate transgression was the invocation of the Black Wind Night itself, an act designed to secure a harvest from the cursed land, but at the cost of the lineage's very essence. The ritual had called upon a truly primal force, a parasitic spirit that had lain dormant, awakened and directed by human greed. The climax was imminent. The barometer outside the decrepit homestead plummeted, and the air grew impossibly still, heavy with an electric charge that prickled the skin. The unnaturally dark wind, silent yet palpable, began to gather on the horizon, not a typical storm, but a directed force. It was the Black Wind Night, not a metaphor, but a living, breathing malevolence seeking its final payment. The Miller family, trapped between a forgotten past and a horrifying present, understood that this was not a storm to weather, but a sentient hunger to confront. They stood together in the living room, the flickering lamplight casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to twist into skeletal forms. The youngest Miller, Elias, now lay almost catatonic, his breathing shallow, his skin unnaturally cold. His parents, grief-stricken but resolute, knew what they had to do. The journal, open to its final frantic entry, detailed a counter-ritual, a desperate gamble based on reversing the flow of the original transgression. It wasn't about appeasement, it was about severing the connection, a ritual of radical, painful renunciation. The Black Wind Night hit the homestead with an audible impact, not of wind, but of something immense and unseen pressing against the very structure. Gust, black and thick, seeped through every crevice, carrying with it a scent of decay and ancient earth. The air grew frigid, the temperature dropping several degrees in an instant, and then the whispers began, a cacophony of desperate voices from generations past, crying out in agony and accusation. Guided by the journal's instructions, the Millers prepared their ritual. It involved a specific bloodline offering, not of life to the entity, but of a symbolic rejection of the cursed inheritance, a severing of the blood ties that bound them. The patriarch, with trembling hands, cut his palm, allowing his blood to mix with dust collected from the base of the ancient, withered tree outside, the very tree Thomas Miller was said to have made his bargain under. This was not a sacrifice to the curse, but an act of defilement to it, a declaration of independence from its grasp. As the blood mixed with the earth, smeared onto the oldest family photograph, the black wind intensified inside the house. Invisible hands clawed at the walls. The furniture groaned as if under immense pressure. The child, Elias, let out a piercing shriek, his small body arching violently as if possessed. The entity was fighting back, desperate to claim its prize. The specialist, observing from a corner, his documentary camera forgotten, was no longer just an academic. He was a witness to something that defied all logic, a primal battle for a family's soul. The Millers, eyes fixed on the struggling child, continued the counter-ritual, reciting ancient words of defiance and severing, words they barely understood but felt deep in their marrow. The old woman, the elder, placed her hand over Elias's forehead, her frail strength pouring into him, pushing back against the encroaching darkness. Her face was a mask of strained determination, her eyes burning with an ancestral fire. She was challenging the entity directly, offering herself as a shield. Then, with a sound like a tearing fabric of reality, the oppressive presence within the house seemed to recoil. The furious whispers coalesced into a single enraged roar that rattled the very foundations of the homestead. And then, as suddenly as it began, it receded. The frigid air warmed fractionally. The dust settled, though it left an unsettling residue. Elias's body relaxed, his breathing deepened, and the predatory hunger in his eyes faded, replaced by exhaustion. The black wind night outside still raged, but its oppressive, malevolent focus on the Miller homestead had lessened. It was as if the entity had been wounded, or at least thwarted, forced to retreat. The silence that followed was not one of peace, but of a temporary, uneasy truce. The family looked at each other, disoriented, battered, but alive. The specialist, trembling, knew he had witnessed a profound and terrifying victory, not against a natural storm, but against a curse woven into the fabric of American soil. The true history of the plains was not merely economic and social. It was supernatural, rooted in desperate pacts and ancient forces that lingered, waiting for their chance to reawaken. The Millers had faced their inheritance, but the question remained: for how long had they truly severed the ties, and what scars would this night leave on their lineage? A constant reminder of the sinister secret of the Black Wind Night. The Miller family's desperate gamble against the Black Wind Night exacted a terrifying toll. While the child, young Ilara, slowly receded from her frightening transformation, the elder Miller, Sarah, did not survive the night. Her passing, though tragic, seemed to absorb the brunt of the immediate supernatural backlash, a final, horrifying sacrifice that temporarily quelled the malevolent storm. The wind, which had raged with unnatural fury, simply died, leaving behind an unsettling silence and a landscape caked in a fresh, black layer of dust that seemed to cling to everything like a shroud. The surviving Millers, Ilara's parents Clara and Thomas, and Clara's aging aunt Beatrice, emerged from the homestead not unscathed but undeniably alive. They were shells of their former selves, haunted by what they had witnessed and what they had done. Their immediate future was uncertain. The land, once their tether, had become their tormentor. Yet leaving was not a simple option. Generations of their very being were intertwined with that cursed soil. Our team, shaken to its core, remained for days, meticulously cataloging the aftermath. The scientific equipment, which had registered impossible energy spikes and anomalous atmospheric pressures during the tempest, now lay inert, offering no further readings. But the physical evidence was undeniable. The strange black dust, when analyzed later, contained microscopic organic matter and mineral composites that defied geological classification, unlike anything found naturally on Earth. We had recorded the chilling vocalizations, the inexplicable shifts in Ilara's physiology, the sudden, violent death of Sarah Miller. The sheer volume and consistency of these anomalies rendered skepticism obsolete. What we bore witness to at the Miller homestead was not a delusion, not a mass hysteria, but a direct, terrifying confrontation with something beyond our current understanding. It was a dark echo from a desperate past, made manifest in a horrifying present. The Miller family, through a combination of ancient knowledge and desperate courage, had not eradicated the curse, but merely pushed it back, buying themselves, perhaps, another generation of precarious existence. The Black Wind Night, we concluded, was not merely a storm. It was the physical embodiment of the unfulfilled pact, a sentient hunger demanding its pound of flesh, an entity born of human desperation and a monstrous terrestrial response. Clara and Thomas Miller with Alara, eventually chose to stay on the land. They couldn't bring themselves to abandon the ancestral home, perhaps believing that their presence, their vigilance, was the only thing preventing the curse from truly breaking free. Aunt Beatrice, frail but resolute, has taken on the mantle of the family's secret keeper, meticulously studying the tattered journals and faded diagrams inherited from generations past. They live a quiet, isolated life, forever on guard, forever listening for the first faint whisper of that unnatural wind. Their struggle continues, a silent, perpetual battle against a horror woven into their very DNA. The implications of the Miller case extend far beyond their dusty farm. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that some historical wounds never truly heal, that forgotten transgressions can fester, taking on a life of their own. It suggests that the land itself can bear witness, that the earth can remember, and that the consequences of extreme human desperation can transcend the boundaries of life and death, science and spirit. The Miller family's tale is not just a story of one lineage. It is a chilling testament to the unseen forces that may lurk beneath the surface of our most desolate landscapes, waiting for the right conditions to awaken. For years, The Hidden Horror has brought you documented accounts of unexplained phenomena, historical mysteries, and true tales of terror. The Miller family case, however, stands as a chilling cornerstone, offering irrefutable documented proof that some nightmares are not confined to folklore. They are real, they are tangible, and they demand attention. We invite you to delve deeper into the archives of The Hidden Horror. Explore other cases that challenge our understanding of reality. Subscribe to our channel to be notified of new investigations as we continue our mission to uncover the unsettling truths hidden in the forgotten corners of America and beyond. Your support allows us to continue bringing these vital, terrifying stories to light. Join us as we explore the shadows, for some secrets refuse to stay buried. We believe that by documenting these phenomena, by bringing them into the light, we might one day begin to comprehend the true nature of the hidden horrors that walk among us. Share this story, discuss it, and prepare yourself, for the black wind night may be just one breath away from your own doorstep. This is The Hidden Horror, and the truth, as always, is far more terrifying than fiction.